This week, Gary Orenstein from Bitwarden is with us to discuss dealing with passwords, identity, and devices as employees' work and home lives blur together. Then Jason Oeltjen from Ping Identity joins us to talk about migrating identity to the cloud. Finally, in the enterprise security news, the company behind Basecamp and the Hey.com email service pulls anchor and exits the cloud. Your self-hosted Exchange server might be a problem. Really? Gen Z and millennials found not taking things seriously in survey fielded by boomers. Again, really? Industrial cybersecurity market expected to take off. Layoffs and exit troubles. All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
Don't leave the door open. Secure your APIs with the Curity Identity Server. Curity allows you to centralize identity management policies with a solution developed by an expert team using well-established standards. Curity facilitates scalable security for apps and websites by offering a unique combination of identity and access management with API security. Protect your users, secure apps and websites, manage API access. Start your free trial today at securityweekly.com/curity.
Attacks can't be prevented, but they can be stopped. Modern cyber attackers have already made it inside your network, but you have the upper hand. Find and eradicate threats with ExtraHop network detection and response, and shut them out before real damage is done. Learn the advanced techniques attackers are using and how ExtraHop stops them with a live attack simulation. Register at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop. That's extra HOP.
Enterprise Security Weekly, and happy National American Beer Day. Tyler, you're drinking the wrong stuff. This is episode number 294, recorded on Thursday, October 27th, 2022. I am your host, Matt Alderman, sitting in for Adrian. It is so nice to be live again because I don't get to do my BSW podcast live right now, so it's fun to be live. Joining are my co-hosts for this week. First, Mr. Tyler Shields, who's drinking bourbon, not beer.
I am always drinking the right stuff. I never drink the wrong stuff. But that being said, I'm just not a beer guy. I don't know. It makes me feel kind of bloated. As I've gotten older, I've switched to pretty much bourbon, pretty much straight liquor.
Yes, bourbon was yesterday. Vodka was Tuesday. I switch it up a little bit here and there.
Got to have the priorities, Matt. Got to have priorities.
Yes. Also joining is Katie Teitler. Welcome, Katie.
Hello. Good to see you.
It's been so long. We got on before the show. I was like, oh my gosh, so good to see you guys. It's been so long.
It's been a minute. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Adrian threw in some beer trivia. So most Americans know the oldest brewery is Yuengling. They don't let us forget about it because it's posted like everywhere on all their bottles. But what's the second oldest brewery? Does anybody know? Anybody?
Oh, man, that's a tough question. Is it Miller Coors?
Not quite.
Molson Coors.
Hold that one for the next one. It's Pabst.
Oh.
Pabst Brewing Company is the second oldest beer company. Get yourself a Pabst Blue Ribbon, folks.
That explains why the hipsters like it, right? It's the furthest throwback you can do.
Right, exactly right. And most folks would correctly guess that the largest U.S. brewery is Anheuser-Busch, but it's owned by Belgium-based AB InBev, the world's largest brewing company. What's the largest U.S.-owned brewery?
Is this where I say Miller Coors?
It's Molson Coors, Miller Coors, yeah.
Gotcha. It's all the same.
Wait, Miller and Molson are the same thing. I know that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they merged a couple years ago. Yeah, it's all together now, I think. So, all right. Sorry, I had to do that. Adrian gave them to me, so there we go. Follow us on Twitter for live stream reminders, highlighted clips, memes, and more. Our Twitter handle is @SecWeekly. Gary Orenstein is Chief Customer Officer at Bitwarden. Gary has a long history of marketing and product roles in tech with a focus on data storage, cloud computing, and security. Gary, welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly.
Thanks very much for having us. Nice to be here.
All right. So as Chief Customer Officer, I looked at Bitwarden because I had to remind myself, so many tech companies these days, right? And I'm like, well, that's an interesting role because as a company, you serve consumers, like personal and business. So as a Chief Customer Officer, do you work with both the personal side and the business side, or do you focus more on the business side? I'm just curious kind of your role.
We do it all and serve both individuals and the world's largest companies to help them with password management. And it's just a really fun part of the business that Bitwarden is in. On the individual side, one of the wonderful things is that we have a fully featured free version that anybody can use. And we think that's important for people to be able to advance their own personal security. And then working with companies who have realized that they want to empower their employees. So it's the whole combination that we handle.
So as you think about the last 2+ years, 2.5, we're working, it's been this pandemic for a while.
Yeah.
What do you see from the personal side to the business side? What's blurring? Like, I know lines are blurring because I see it in my life and I know everybody else sees it. Like, where are we starting to see kind of the blurred crossover between your personal and your business life?
Yeah. Well, I think many people, certainly those in who operate in digital economy, and we're all thrust into having our home office and our remote office, and maybe we've done that here and there previously, but it really became a full-time endeavor for us, and what that meant is you had to take care of your own stuff in terms of the different devices and logging into different accounts. And what we saw is that for a lot of people, having a password manager really helps them, both in how they manage their personal life, how they manage their work life at home, and how they manage their work life at work. Of course, when everybody was distributed and no longer together in the office, all of a sudden the imperative of sharing sensitive information securely became paramount. And so we saw a lot of growth for people who said, now that we're distributed, we need a way that we can share passwords or other sensitive information securely, and using a password manager is one of those tools that helps you with that. And then I think just the last point here is, when you think about tools that we use at work and that we use at home, there's only a few that are really that common. Email, of course, and maybe collaborative docs and so forth. But password management is one of those tools and utilities that helps you in both places. And I think that there's some really interesting adoption dynamics and market dynamics that happen because of that.
Now, I use a password manager. I've been using a password manager for a long time. I use it for both personal and for work. I actually have 2 of them. Don't ask. But here's what I like about the password managers. It allows us to create very secure passwords very easily, because I think one of the big challenges is password reuse, right? Because if you
huge.
have to have, right? I mean, think about this. You're signing up for all these accounts. You're using the same password, and that credential gets leaked. That's a brute force attack waiting to happen, which is why we see some of these breaches head down that path. The password manager allows you to easily create different strong password sequences without having to remember like all the crazy characters and all this stuff, such that you're actually more secure when you're using a password manager. I think that's a very positive thing.
Yeah, and it takes a little bit sometimes to digest, but I think we all know now, and we see now, these unfortunate breaches that occur. And what the experts recommend is that the best way that you can protect yourself, and the best way that you can take your own online security into account, is to have a strong and unique password for every website that you visit. But if you think about that, like doing that yourself as a human being is nearly impossible. But there are these wonderful software tools called password managers that make it really easy. I mean, even in my own life, like I can't remember the last time I had to think of a new one, because I just pressed the generator button. Password generators are built into password managers, and you just generate the button and you can have a 16 random character string, and there you go, you're off to the races. So I think if until you get into that flow and realize how easy it is, the other part that's becomes so easy is you get these emails like, oh, you have to update your password. Well, I don't want to think about it. I don't want to worry about it, come up with some new, combination of stuff. So it's great. I'll just generate a new one. Password managers, at least, Bitwarden, we store the history of your previous one. So if anything happens, you're in a good spot. And it just really simplifies the way that you can conduct your life online, since we're all, operating with all these different accounts.
Yeah. Now, as a product person in the human risk management space, we definitely view password managers as vigilant behavior in our risk model. Let's talk about password sharing, though, because that's the other piece you mentioned a little bit about earlier. Securely sharing passwords versus just sharing passwords, like, what's the difference? Because when I think about this, we actually look for sharing credentials. It's part of our awareness training. It's part of how we track risky and vigilant behaviors. What's the difference between just sharing credentials but versus securely sharing them through something like a password manager? Is there a big difference? Is the password manager sharing truly a better way to share passwords with other people that need access to certain accounts?
Well, we think so, obviously, and I'll explain why. For example, say the marketing team wants to, collaborate on a social network, right? Even Twitter is a good example. Twitter doesn't have a multi-user interface, right? So if you're a company with a Twitter account, you get to sign in once. Well, you want to protect that credential, but you might need more than one person on the social media team, and so instead of sharing that password through a messaging system or an email, which is an unencrypted service that is also going to have a whole data retention thing forever, like that's going to lie around and then leave you potentially susceptible to somebody getting that password inappropriately. In a password manager, that credential is encrypted from the very moment it's on your device, and then it can be shared through using a sharing mechanism, the password manager, to the next person who also has an end-to-end encrypted account on the same password manager, and can see that credential for themselves, but in between, nobody else can see it. So that idea of using end-to-end encryption to protect these important credentials is really, really important. And then, one other thing that a lot of password managers do, and Bitwarden does, is you can also incorporate two-factor authentication into the credential. So think about collaborating with friends on a social media account. You want to protect that social media account with two-factor authentication as well, but how are you going to share that across multiple people? Well, you can share that inside the password manager. So a lot of secure and simple options for people to be able to operate safely online and in a collaborative setting.
So let me ask you a question here. So we talk about, and Matt, of course, you live this every day, but we talk about never share your passwords with our users. That's one of the gospels we preach in the world of security and risk. What are some valid uses of credential sharing, secure credential sharing?
Yeah, well, I think the social media example is one. Marketing tends to be a common use case. Finance areas tend to be a common use case. Tech companies are a common use case. We're all using these online services, and sometimes the online services have user administration, and sometimes they don't. And so when they don't have user administration, you really want a mechanism by which you can share these credentials easily across your team in a secure fashion. So again, whether it's the social media team, we have customers, for example, in the legal and real estate industry. And they might be managing properties and property systems on behalf of their clients. And so, if you want to have redundancy that a certain number of people can have the ability to service a client, and there isn't a mechanism for user administration in that, well, then you can supplement that by using a password manager and sharing those credentials securely.
Wouldn't it be a competitive advantage for some companies, whether they're social media or finance or whatever the examples you gave? Wouldn't it be a competitive advantage, at least in terms of security and risk, not only for them, but for their buyers, to create that admin function if they don't have it?
Oh, potentially. but there are what we find is that employees at companies will focus first and foremost on the tools they can use to get their job done, and sometimes secondly on security. So by
they're going to do it anyway.
Yeah, and we're human beings, and we just want to get the job done. So by infusing the tools for people, by making the tools available to people, infusing that into the culture, we think that all in all, companies end up with a much more secure operating environment, because employees are not generating silly passwords based on pets' names or the company name plus the year plus the exclamation point, which we know is frequently used. And so they're doing that on a whole variety of accounts, including those that need to be shared.
Yeah, absolutely. The one case you didn't, you touched on a little bit. You said tech companies, but the developer use case, right? Because think about the developers and all the systems they have to gain access to. I guess it would be way better to use a password manager than sharing credentials in your Git repository, for example.
Exactly. What you want to do is you want the sensitive information in an end-to-end encrypted solution. And then you want that end-to-end encrypted solution to be readily available. So you want it to be available on all your devices. You want it to be available on all the computers that you use, all the operating systems that you use. You want them to be available in different browsers that you use. So, that's one approach that Bitwarden takes, try to say, if in order for you to make use of a tool that delivers end-to-end encryption, you've got to make it easy and accessible to all the platforms that people use. And then once you do that, yes, much better to keep credentials in a encrypted end-to-end encryption solution than to put them on GitHub or to keep them on a shared drive somewhere in the enterprise IT domain. People have been sharing credentials since credentials began. So I think this idea will be with us for some time, and particularly with application development and developers, there is a huge need to have these kind of solutions.
So Paul got really smart with our code. They used to be in the code, right? And then he pulled them out and put them in as environment variables. Still not as secure, but better than being in the Git repositories. I'm just saying.
Yes. Yes. Good job.
Yes, he was very security minded and did the right thing by removing the credentials out of the code. I'm just not sure that the environment variable was more secure, but you know what I mean, right? These are use cases that definitely come into play. Passwordless. What's the future of passwords and this whole concept of passwordless? Microsoft's been pushing this pretty hard, right? We've talked about this for a long time. Like, can we ever get away from the password? Will passwordless ever come to fruition?
I hope so. And we are big supporters of all the activity that's happening in passwordless. In fact, today, you can live a passwordless life with Bitwarden today. You can set up biometric authentication to get into your vault. You can use a security key for two-factor authentication if you want to do that. You can use Face ID. You can generate passwords at the push of a button. So today, for example, I autofill everything. I don't think about my passwords except for the one main primary password I have to get into Bitwarden. So in some degree, the people who are using password managers to their full extent, they already have a passwordless life. Obviously, there's stuff behind it, but the way that they interact is largely passwordless. From there, we start to go into new areas, right? So talked a little bit about security keys and FIDO2, and that being the dominant standard that's helping usher these passwordless authentication technologies into life. So that's one step that we have, whether you're using a YubiKey or Nitro Key or Solo Key, or many options available for people. And then we're starting to see these new developments on pass keys, which you can think of in a very high level as a password that is generated and created specific to a device and a service. And so that gives it a little bit of protection, protection from phishing, protection from being stolen and used elsewhere. But of course, the flip side of that is, well, now what happens if I lose my phone? So there's still, some work underway on, of course, the passwordless is one road, and then the recovery situation is another. So even some of these larger companies, when they talk about their passwordless solutions, you still, if you want to be able to recover your account, let's say you're traveling with your laptop and your phone, and have an unfortunate situation where both are stolen. Well, now how are you going to get back in? So there's some work going on there to further the standards, and all of this will happen over the coming years. And Bitwarden is 100% behind it. We support FIDO2 today in a variety of situations, and there's a lot more coming. So I think it will take some time, but it's clearly something that people want, and it's clearly something that people are going to get, and then individuals will see, what's right for them. I will say, there are people in the Bitwarden community who are not fond of biometrics because they think there might be a scenario where something may be forced. So those people like the idea of having a password that resides in their brain that only they can determine if they're going to release to somebody. So there's a whole spectrum, but definitely we're looking forward to continuing a long journey on developing more and more passwordless technologies with Bitwarden.
Yeah. Gary, too, is, for those folks that have that level of requirement of security, doesn't it just make sense to augment with the additional item? Meaning, let's set up the base passwordless model or biometric model as best we can, use that everywhere, and then for those systems that are super ultra secure, augment with a password. Like, don't make that the default first line of defense. Make that the secondary component that you layer on.
Sure, absolutely. And there's a variety of combinations that work for different set of security profiles. But I think what we are going to see is more services and more people wanting to default to the passwordless option. And so that's certainly where the gravity is right now.
Yeah. I would argue we're already pretty heavily down that path. I pick up my phone all the time, and I literally just use the thumbprint. Bang, I'm into whatever I need to get into. Right, I open up my financial systems, hit the thumbprint again. I'm into that. I don't have to remember passwords anymore. Not because I necessarily use a password safe, but because it's built into my device.
Mm-hmm. Correct, and the services that implement that are able to take advantage of that.
Yep.
Those biometric functions natively.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to go back and visit the security keys here for a second, right? Because I remember the days when I was at RSA and two-factor authentication was becoming a requirement on the financial side, and RSA thought everybody was going to have a token, right? It didn't work out that way, just for those who didn't keep up. So it was because we went to other mechanisms to support this, right? We didn't need the token. We could use the phone or we could use SMS. Now, we know that there are challenges with SMS-based multi-factor authentication after a la Uber and Twilio, right? And so I guess the question becomes, are we going to see a resurgence in physical keys? Is the phone enough? There's so many combinations here. I'm not a big fan of carrying around a separate YubiKey, for example. Paul loves them. He uses them. I've never gotten into, trying to find my damn car keys to figure out where my YubiKey is. I just use my phone. Do we need the physical security keys? Is the phone going to be enough for most of us? Back to Tyler's point a little bit, that's what we're mostly used to. I'm just curious your thoughts there.
Yeah. I think on the individual side, we're definitely going to see the phone become the validation device or the proxy for generating the validation, because that's what everybody has. And if you're operating a large site with millions of users, you don't want to wait for people to adopt a physical security key to enhance the protection of your user base. But I think in companies, it's a very different story. I think there is a degree of control and security that the physical security key brings that just fits in line with the way a lot of enterprises like to operate. And so particularly for core teams, core IT teams, site reliability teams, folks who are involved in the critical operations, I think that we will continue to see ongoing adoption of security keys or various things like a security key, meaning that it's not tied to your phone, it's not tied to your company phone, it's an independent item that the company can audit and keep track of who gets what. And I think that just fits in line with the way a lot of large companies like to manage their security posture.
Yeah, I can definitely see it in certain areas of the federal government where we're dealing with top secret and very classified information. Makes complete sense. I just, certain environments, we're going to cover an article later about the Gen Z and the millennials, and they don't take security as seriously, right? Like, this is a perfect example of that. Like, they don't want to carry around some physical thing on their keychain. I can see them not wanting to do that. And I'm just wondering, is there enough pushback that companies who want to do it, it's going to be difficult from a cultural perspective.
And I think, in the consumer world, we're going to see the phone or other devices become that, key or proxy for the key. And in the enterprise, we'll see it in select areas where people are using the physical security key. And I think that survey that you mentioned is really interesting in that, in the employment world, when you go to work, sometimes you're excited about your new tools and sometimes you're not. And so we talk a lot with people about the adoption of password managers and how to foster that. I always, say, like, you rarely find somebody who says they like passwords, but if you ask somebody if they like their password manager, they'll all say yes. They love their password manager. And so it's just an interesting dynamic. And now you have people at work and you want to get them to use a password manager, but a lot of people at work, they say, I have my job. I don't want to learn something new. However, if you can entice that person to use the password manager at home to protect themselves or their family and their personal life, which may be something that they care more about, well, that skill set that they build will just carry back into the workplace. So going back to your initial questions about serving individuals and serving businesses, in our opinion, there's no difference between an employee and an individual in many respects, right? It's just a person trying to stay safe online. And the question is, what's the right motivation? We all have friends who use password managers, and we all have friends who do not. Are they going to be more inclined because the work says it's the right thing to do? Some of them will. Or are they going to be inclined because they realize they can take care of their family and their personal credentials? And that may be a more powerful motivator for some people.
It's the concept of password safety versus password security. Safety typically resonates more with the consumer and the ability to make things safe at home, safe for the family. It's a concept we've been talking about for a while on various shows and in the workplace that I'm involved in, is this concept of safety. If you can get it to resonate with the end user, they carry it not only through their personal life, they'll carry it into their work life. And that's a great place to be. If we keep beating up about security, it doesn't necessarily have the same stickiness.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I think the wordplay is critical to get people to understand. And there are a lot of people who hear about security and are going to be like, I don't want to worry about that. That's too much for me. That's too technical for me. But I think, as you said, when you think about safety and personal safety and family safety, those kind of thoughts resonate much closer, I think, with more people.
Yeah. Katie, Tyler, any additional questions for Gary while we have him?
Nothing from me in particular. Katie, do you?
No, this has been great.
Awesome. Gary, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Thanks very much for having us.
Stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to talk about migrating identity to the cloud with Jason Oeltjen from Ping Identity.
When it comes to cybersecurity, the biggest threats are the ones you never see coming. SecureWorks detects and responds to cyber attackers' ever-changing tactics. We come armed with Taegis, a security analytics platform designed to recognize attacks and stop them before they do harm. SecureWorks, defending every corner of cyberspace. Learn more at securityweekly.com/SecureWorks. The shift to remote and hybrid work over the past 2 years has accelerated application development on cloud infrastructure. However, securing these new assets has lagged behind. Qualys CloudView, the next generation of cloud security posture management, delivers an end-to-end multi-cloud security and compliance solution encompassing the entire application lifecycle from build to runtime. CloudView enables enterprises to assess their cloud security and compliance posture, identify risks and gaps, auto-remediate issues, proactively enforce best practices, and prove compliance in audits rapidly and efficiently. Identify your most vulnerable cloud assets by visiting securityweekly.com/Qualys.
Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions often and will reach out to you once reviewed. This segment is sponsored by Ping Identity. To learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/ping. Jason Oeltjen is the Vice President of Product Management for Ping Identity, where he focuses on understanding identity challenges of customers and aligning Ping's capabilities to meet those needs. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
We have similar roles in product management, so we can share war stories together. It's always fun.
Love that.
Yeah, so do I. So we're going to talk about this concept of moving identities into the cloud. And as Adrian was preparing me for this segment, he said, I was a little surprised by the description because it suggests that there's an opportunity to replace on-prem IAM products with cloud. Aside from AD, I couldn't really think of any on-prem identity services that might still exist. Are there any?
They're everywhere, believe it or not. When you think about identity, it goes far beyond what Active Directory is providing you. And on-prem includes, there's so many companies that have web access management, like products like SiteMinder, Oracle on-prem, IBM services on-prem. And it's actually surprising to me that the number of those sort of core services of legacy that still exist. But beyond that, Active Directory may be where you put your identity stores and manage your groups, but is that where you're driving your passwordless experience? It's not doing your risk-based analytics to figure out who should access what and if the people are who they claim to be. And all of those services are important cloud services as well as part of identity.
Yeah, and I would imagine that some of those systems are also on-prem. So are we seeing early days, right? I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. I'm old. The days of identity, everything was kind of on-prem. Everything was there. And all my additional systems were on-prem. And you talk about these legacy environments, my ERP systems and all these old systems that have just hung out forever. And so is that including other like privileged access management solutions, et cetera? Like are there a lot of those kind of legacy on-prem pieces that are supporting the on-prem AD that are just still stuck down there?
Yeah,
I call it.
There absolutely is. Now, like something like privilege access management isn't a core product that Ping does. We partner for that, but those services can oftentimes still live on-prem as well. Those cloud providers like us, there's cloud providers bringing that part of your identity infrastructure to the cloud. And one of the keys is because when we talk about these companies, like part of me is like, I can't believe we're still talking about companies starting their cloud journey or like early on their cloud journey. But the enterprises that Ping serves for both their customer identities and their workforce identities are the largest in the world. Like the 9 of the 9 largest banks in the United States run Ping Identity for in their infrastructure. And so when you look at companies like that, high regulation, they're often slow moving. And any company that's older than 10 years certainly has on-prem identity products. And most of the time, there's still something in their infrastructure.
So if I'm in this environment so let's start with why move to the cloud before I get into who. But why? What's the advantages of moving some of this stuff out of your on-prem environment up into the cloud? What's the value proposition for organizations to want to make this move? Because my guess is this is not an easy migration.
No, I mean, the migration is as complex as the environment we're trying to migrate. But the reasons people are moving to the cloud is there's a couple of reasons and some current event reasons. For example, as companies came into COVID over the last 2.5 or 3 years, however long that's been now, we saw this need for this acceleration of a zero trust security model, which includes identity and a lot of non-identity things, as you all in this podcast are likely aware. And being able to support that model in a way that doesn't burden my IT teams. IT teams are strapped, especially going into an uncertain economic environment. They're not getting a ton of extra funding for headcount. So guess what? If you offload all those upgrades, all that patching that you've been doing for all of those years, and all of that maintenance of your own infrastructure, take that off your plate. Let somebody like Ping take care of that for you. You're going to see a lot of advantages, and the total cost of ownership of your systems is going to go down. The ability to scale and protect it goes up because we are using, cloud services that are, under attack. It seems weird, but they're under attack all the time. But guess what? That means they have huge numbers of teams preventing those attacks, as opposed to potentially your on-prem infrastructure. So getting that into those environments, enabling that scale to burst to just like crazy amounts of scale, without you having to like stand up servers or virtual machines in your environment or Docker, et cetera, is another reason. For example, we have a major television manufacturer, and they moved to Ping's cloud to support login on their TV, and they moved right before the Super Bowl. So we were able to burst with them to well over 50,000 transactions per second, which was something that in their infrastructure would have done an enormous burden on their teams to be able to scale to for the duration of the Super Bowl.
And I imagine as we moved our employees into remote work environments, we didn't necessarily want everybody coming through the VPN to gain access to identity systems, right? I mean, this is part of the other advantage, I would imagine, from the cloud perspective, is it supported that hybrid remote work model a little easier and at more scale than trying to shove every employee through the VPN.
Yeah, 100%. And as we see, for those familiar with the zero trust model, the idea is no longer do you do the VPN model where you build a moat around it, and once you get inside the moat, you're safe. You're now putting the security at the resource you're trying to access. And so that shift alone requires us to rethink that identity. And now, as you mentioned, our resources are now working from, wherever they want, quite honestly. And so we have to protect them from wherever they are. And we have to be able to recognize them as themselves and know when to put friction in front of them before we let them have access, or when to let them get through in a frictionless way, because we have a high confidence of who they are. All of those services are more efficiently delivered from the cloud, as opposed to trying to stand them up in your own data centers.
Yeah, we were talking earlier before the show about minimum viable security. Identity is part of your MVS. There's no doubt about it. I'm an app user data guy, right? The three things corporations have to control is their applications, their data, and their users, because they're tightly tied. You may not own your infrastructure, you may not own your endpoints, but you own those other three. And so to your point, if I'm looking at ways to save costs in certain areas so I can make investments in others, one way to potentially do that is not to have to maintain my own identity infrastructure and allow somebody like Ping to do it for you, which frees up some resources and maybe some dollars to actually go make some other investments as part of your minimum viable security posture.
Yeah, 100%. We see that the teams in charge of the identity infrastructure on-prem are, start with the identity professionals, and their time is better spent not having to patch a server or upgrade a server. Their time is better spent looking at ways to create more efficiency and better security around those users. And so by getting this off of their plate as one more thing of, do I have to do an upgrade on that legacy IAM product this weekend? getting that off of their plate and letting cloud providers take care of all that for you is a huge efficiency savings for these IT teams who are always people strapped. And quite honestly, right now in the market, where the resources, while we're in this strange sort of economic times, resources that can do this stuff effectively and work effectively in this infrastructure and upgrade and IT security and IAM, I'm sure you talk about it regularly on here. Those sort of resources are hard to find. So it's better, if you don't have to have the one doing the mundane stuff of just keep it running, they can be doing more higher value activities for you.
Yeah, finding the resource, but if you have the resource, retaining the resource, because it's a
Good
hot
point.
market out there for those that have the skill set, right? For sure.
100%.
So-
The market is still really hard, and everybody struggles to find them. But we're lucky at Ping, and I think everybody like us, we are able to retain and attract good talent. But that's not necessarily true for all of our customers. So it really is a challenging market.
So I assume the answer to this next question is all the above, but it's going to tie into kind of like, where do people start? I mean, are we talking employee identities, customer identities, partner identities? I assume it's all of the above, right?
Yes, all of the above. And so people's journey varies depending on which one of those identities is sort of the biggest pain point for them. I'll say in the market today, we're seeing a higher growth in the customer identity, because in customer identity, getting those identities centrally managed, getting those identities to create great experiences so they can reduce friction for them to log in and make them want to come back and do more business with you. That's a big priority for companies as they look for any edge they can get in retaining customers and keeping them coming back. So we're seeing a faster growth in that customer identity market.
Is that where you see the initial migration priorities coming from? I'm trying to think about, that's a lot. It's potentially a lot of work is part of this migration, right? And so do you start with something like customers because it sets the foundation, it creates a better customer experience, and that becomes kind of the initial project for the migration, and then you can leverage that to then go after partners and employees? Is that a logical first step for most?
It is for many. I wouldn't say most. There is, the customer market is growing faster in sort of new acquisition, and because the customer identity market has been this sporadic do-it-yourself thing, and now that they're sick of doing it themselves and they understand the value in creating better experiences through a centralized experience, that is one avenue, as you described. But another way, I was visiting with a customer this week, and they're taking the opposite. They're saying, "Hey, our workforce is disparate. Our workforce is costing us a lot in infrastructure, and we're spending a lot of time maintaining our own infrastructure." So they're asking us, "Hey, Ping, how can you help us get our workforce to a passwordless experience? How can you help us get our workforce to a cloud-based experience and offload that?" And then you can kind of highlight the highest priority items based on, either higher priority or sort of low-hanging fruit where you get quick wins, and address it that way as well. So we see customers coming at it from both perspectives. It kind of depends who the initial sort of project owner is and what their motivations are.
Yeah, you brought up, I think you said passwordless in that last sentence. We talked about this briefly in the previous segment, right? We were talking about, Google does so much for us these days, right? Authentication with our Google credentials, and it gives us access to all these other things. And as a consumer, it's a really great environment. All I need is primarily my primary credentials with my phone, because I might need my authenticator. And from a customer experience, that streamlines things. It makes it really easy to get customers to sign up and be able to move forward. And that's why I can see the customer kind of experience being one, if you're dealing with consumers that are used to these environments where they don't want to deal with a lot of different user accounts. They want a really streamlined way to log in and gain access to your systems. That use case resonates, I think, on the consumer side.
Yeah, it 100% does. In fact, we did a survey about a year ago, and 50% of the respondents of that survey said, "I would choose one service over another just because it's easier to log in." And then, and even like 63% of those people said, I would actually abandon a service and choose a different one because it's easier to log in. When you're talking about these consumer services, that experience is everything. And Google, like we obviously integrate, so you can use Ping to like deliver your Google one-time, your authentication there. And that way we're able to capture, make sure we're doing the proper risk analysis on top of it and capture the data in a way that's actually usable for the companies like trying to give great experiences to their consumers.
Yeah. Obviously, employers, where do partners fit in this? We've seen a lot with supply chain issues. Third-party risk has always been one of those interesting areas. How does this impact, like, what do you do with your partners, right? I think about some of the interesting third-party use cases back when I was working at the bank and think about having those third partners come in and access certain systems that have sensitive data on them. Is it similar to just another employee use case with a different set of policies around it, or is there more involved in bringing the partners into the mix?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it kind of depends on the type of, because partner can mean so many things, right? It could mean your augmented workforce. It could mean like a B2B to C, where the B2B, the business you do business with and their consumers. And so there's a bunch of different that I kind of lump into that sort of partner umbrella. But absolutely, it often mirrors either the customer or the workforce use case. But what you really want to be able to do is, if a partner's coming in, I don't want to give them the normal login of my employees. I want to let them know I recognize them differently. They're going to probably have a slightly different authentication and login experience. I'm going to put a different set of policies and rules on it. I'm going to create a different workflow and probably even set my sort of risk scoring and my fraud scoring a little bit different potentially on partners, depending on what kind of partners they are. So it looks a lot like workforce on the surface, but you are separating them and handling them different in their experience.
Interesting. I'm going to let Katie or Tyler hop in here, but I have more questions for Jason.
Before I pass it back to you, Matt, to kind of dig on some of those things, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit. I think moving identity to the cloud is a very important thing for the consumer or for the end point or the end individual authentication. What I am also seeing is a rapid uptake in machine-to-machine identity authentication. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that playing out? Do you see that growing significantly? Are there some authentication, maybe not even machine-to-machine, but maybe endpoint-to-endpoint or API-to-API if we're talking at the app layer? Are you seeing that growing as well? And if so, is there anything new that we have to consider from a application development or business standpoint on how to secure our systems in that way?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things I would mention on that. So certainly when you think about a zero trust framework, you're trying to, instead of that VPN, like, walled castle or moated castle, and once you get it through across the moat, everything's open. The idea is everything's secure at its, at the point of access. So it is trying to make sure you are who you say you are at the time you access that resource. And if you're a machine trying to access that resource, you have to have the same thing. So it could be certificate-based access, and you have to put if it's an API, you're putting some API intelligence around it. So you're using AI to go and determine, does this API call look like what I expect it to look like? If not, what should I do about it? Do I need to block it? What do I need to signal? So there is definitely a lot to think about when you think of machine to machine and API to API, which is kind of the software layer of that machine to machine.
Yeah, I think the communication paths between applications are only going to significantly grow as applications get cloud native and begin to be more atomized, where what used to be one application now turns into 50. All of those components have to communicate. All of the backends have to communicate. All of the functions as a service have to communicate, et cetera. And so I'm seeing explosive growth in there. And managing those tokens, those authentication credentials, those permissions, so to speak, becomes a largely untenuous or impossible to actually track type of solution in a massive a massive enterprise environment. So I think finding ways to have a centralized system to manage those types of things, whether it's Ping Identity or someone else, makes a whole lot of sense. And I don't know Ping's products intimately enough to say whether that's something that you guys cover, but hopefully it does, because I think that's going to be a massively high growth area in the near future.
Yeah, and the reality is, like, that sort of token server is something. It was the base product that built Ping from the very beginning, 20 years ago in an on-prem software, and that product is still now certainly delivered. That those capabilities delivered through the cloud now, but those capabilities are still the core of what we do. Being able to manage those in those complex environments, like I mentioned, we manage the largest, most complex companies in the world. Major airlines, the biggest banks, the biggest healthcare companies in the world. And so the number of servers that they have and the token management is something that we've been able to learn along with these complex customers over the course of 20 years, which is a long time in a software company lifespan, to be able to do that at high scale and with reliability.
Yeah, and I think, Tyler brings up a really good point on the API side, because the API use cases are not only internal app to app and platform to platform, because it's the internal API discussion, right? Which, being in a product company, we have to deal with. But then it's also the external connections, right?
That's right.
Because now you have third-party partners that need to gain access to some of the data, or you need to expose an API endpoint for somebody to download data. So the use cases for APIs mirror almost the same as identity. You have like your employer pool, which is kind of all your internal APIs. You have your partner pool, which are all these APIs you're using to serve up to integration partners. And you almost have this customer version of APIs that are interacting with your external endpoints to transact their actual business or whatever service that you're offering. And so with APIs, just the explosion of these things across and being able to manage all three of those use cases could be pretty daunting for most organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And not even just across those use cases. So think about, certainly, like, all of those different use cases result in different levels of complexity that we need to handle in that sort of API access management. But then when you think about, okay, this API call came in this way, so this person is entitled, or this machine is entitled to access only this, and read only or read write. Like, what can they do within the context of the session that they came in with, or what do I need to get more permission to do? Like, let's say a high value trade in a banking system where you want to transfer $20,000 from one account to another. That's going to take a lot more security, and we have to have that fine-grained control over that data point and that access to say, yes, you can transfer it, or maybe you can only view it because of what we know about you so far through that API call. So it's those three use cases you mentioned, but then they explode out when you think about the context and the session information we have on which they came into that request.
So you mentioned, in terms of some of your typical users, financial services, airline industry, what are some other types of companies, and is there a size of company or size of security, IT, identity management organization that is more likely to be using your services at this point? Where is the early adoption, and where do you see the growth happening?
Yeah, so we the size of companies we serve really start, if you think about like an employee count, I would say we really start at 1,000. Certainly you sell some less than that, but we go up to hundreds of thousands of employees. And that the larger the company, the bigger the sweet spot it is for what we do. And similarly for customer identities, maybe while we have a lot smaller, if it starts to, it goes kind of 1 million to 100 million or hundreds of millions of customer identities that we support across those industries. So we support, for example, a huge ticketing, a huge branding ticketing agency, and so when Taylor Swift tickets go on sale, those people need to be able to authenticate really darn quickly, or they're going to be pretty upset. So we have that kind of stuff really like weighing on us in everything we do. So just as far as industries, as I mentioned, banking, we have a lot in retail, in large retail. We do a lot in healthcare, in other financial services like insurance, et cetera, as well. Manufacturing is another big one for us. So, but our sweet spot is the large complex. For customers who have sort of what I'll call simple identity problems, we can certainly solve those, and we do like embrace those customers. But there are other competitors who probably win more of those deals than we do, and we really try to focus on the big hairy ones, to be honest.
Sure. So you're really focused on the enterprise, and that's great. Maybe this isn't your sweet spot, but what would be your advice for smaller companies? You know, those companies with a couple hundred employees, with a couple hundred customers. Where should they start? What are the things that they can do, either internally or with partners or with vendors? Maybe it's their MSP or MSSP. Where should they start on this identity and zero trust based journey?
Yeah, the first thing that I would make sure, especially in a small company, I think maybe a little bit surprising how many aren't using any sort of MFA, or they're using potentially SMS MFA. So the place to start is with making sure that you have a centralized identity store where all your identities in, like, we'll start with workforce use case, workforce identities live, and that you have some strong authentication, and then layer on risk and intelligence so that you are actually making sure that authentication is optimized. You're stopping MFA bombing and that kind of thing as well by adding some risk to it. So that's the very basics. So when our customers come to us, whether they're 1,000 or 100 users and they're just getting started, what we typically sell them is a centralized directory, a single sign-on capabilities, and our MFA capabilities with adaptive MFA at minimum, and ideally our machine learning risk engine as well. Like, that's where they start. And even in the consumer use case, it's a very similar starting gate. It's just a little bit different, where the consumer use case, especially on small companies, it's some sort of DIY or haven't really given it much thought before, and getting them to that same baseline is really important. Now, in the consumer use case, you definitely see a lot more like SMS MFA. And so maybe for you feel like that's okay for now. We have opportunities to get you off of that, get you to passwordless through like scanning a QR code only and never creating a username, or, you know, using Magic Link and email and other things to get you to more frictionless things for your customers. But it's still the same base of starting with like defining the journeys and the experiences and putting SSO directory and MFA, intelligent MFA in front of, in those companies.
So last week we talked a little bit, I know you weren't here, but we talked a little bit about some companies who are starting with the consumer experience and how that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you get consumers hooked on a product or a process, authentication is certainly a process, then it's easier to get it into the enterprise. Are you finding that there's still resistance in the enterprise space for some of these things? Because, Matt may have said earlier, I can't remember if it was during this segment or the previous segment, we all have our phones with us, right? They're right here. They've all got passwordless biometric options. A lot of people don't like to carry around any kind of hard token. It might be more secure, but it's a pain in the tush. So where are you finding resistance? Where do you think the best opportunities are? Let's say you're in an organization trying to get your employees, your business leaders to adopt these kind of things. Where's the most resistance, and how do companies get over that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I've been spending a lot of time over the last 3 weeks or so visiting with customers around the globe. And the number one thing is getting your app owners, so your IT department doesn't own all the applications you wish would go through your centralized identity system. So getting them on board. And as you mentioned, like moving to like, hey, can I just use my phone, or can I use the pass or the fingerprint capability on my Mac to access my corporate resources? Getting that kind of stuff set up so that you can give those users a passwordless experience is actually an enticement so that those application owners who are like, I'm just ignoring IT, I'm doing my own thing. The people who use, I don't know, Marketo, they're going to just log in with a username and password instead of me going through this IT process. But these kind of capabilities where now you can centralize it and make it simpler for your end users, now start creating them, giving you the demand you want, where those app owners are more willing. Because the friction in the organizations often comes from getting the other people that you need to cooperate on board with the plan, like on board with the centralized identity system, on board with the idea that we can better secure and make a better experience for our employees or our customers by putting it all in a centralized place. So that is a really big problem. And so we've had some big customers that I've talked to recently that, for example, they take this tops down, like there's a little bit of a tops down mandate, but there's also this bottoms up and communicating out what's in it for you, what's in it for your users, to make this little bit of effort that it goes to go integrate using the standards into the centralized repository. Those are kind of some of the most common pressures we get, getting resistance from the business. I think the second piece I would talk about as far as this cloud migration, a big resistance we get to cloud migration is when you look at the line item of what I'm paying on-prem and the line item of what I'm getting out of the cloud. And while the cloud may not be a lot cheaper or might be more expensive on the line item, we have to get them to see the total value. So we actually have a value team that goes and looks through how much is it costing you for the people to maintain this? How much, how many outages do you have because you're doing upgrades? Or how many nines of availability are you able to support internally, and what does that cost you versus outsourcing that to us? So that total cost is a very important view for us to pitch this message to people who may be running some server in the corner that's running their old Oracle for the last, who knows how many years.
Yes, we know those corner cases well. I want to talk. I want to go double click into the first one, which is the centralization piece, because identity isn't necessarily centrally owned in some of these enterprises. I remember the day when identity was owned by either IT and or HR. It was security had nothing to do with it for the longest time. Like, is it now centralized, or is that part of the challenge with these migrations? Is you got to find all the identity owners because it's not centralized?
Yeah, there definitely is some of that. So more and more you're seeing identity owned by the CISO in an organization. So it is getting, under there. But when I say identity is owned by the CISO, there's always these like disparate things that aren't quite into the centralized ownership yet. And so that's especially in these big companies that have been around for a long time, gone through multiple acquisitions. That is a challenge to bring all of those identities into a central repository. But when you do that, you reduce your attack surface and you have one area to focus on securing your identities and making sure you don't have a breach that impacts your brand reputation.
Yeah. So obviously that's one of the first challenges, get everybody on board. What other challenges as part of this migration you said you guys perform well in these big, sticky, complex environments outside of getting that centralization, which you kind of brought up already. Like, what are those other big challenges that organizations need to address, because it's going to impact the migration? Like, what's the best practice for a migration?
Yeah. So first of all, get a partner that you believe in and you're willing to work through, because you're right, that migration is going to have some challenging parts to get through to the other end. So first of all, make sure you have a strong executive sponsor internally and have a good partner that you can rely on to do that migration with you. Because when the easy stuff is there's a bunch of identity standards that people use for creating SSO and centralizing their organizations. So that's usually the easy stuff. The harder stuff includes migrating your users to a single database. Like some 90% of the Fortune 1000 have Active Directory. but 90 some percent of those have Active Directory plus something. Maybe they acquired a company. Maybe they have this unique set of users that happen to sit in this other database somewhere, or it's not even in the same AD farm at least. So there's those things about centralizing that can be an extremely complex project, and it doesn't have to be solved all up front, but it should be part of the journey. And then the other thing is when you have these legacy applications that identity connects to, because identity doesn't do anything if it doesn't connect to the applications you need. When you have these legacy systems that have been around for long enough and they don't support standards, how are you going to address those? Make sure that when you sign up with a partner, they can meet those use cases. So you're not like, well, we got most things, but we have these 5 legacy applications that we're just rolling the dice on. And so that's the other piece that, where Ping gets into that hairiness, because each one of those could be unique in how the best approach to make sure that gets integrated and secured and the identity is secured for access to that.
Yeah, which means these are staged migrations. These are not all at once kind of projects, right? Because it would be difficult to account for all of those edge cases in one large migration. Yeah,
you can stage them, and some of them that we've done recently, though. In fact, I got a note from our CEO just, I think it was yesterday, about a customer who's like, our users didn't even notice. Like the project team worked their butts off, and the partnership, there was a lot of strain to get there, but the users never noticed. And then you can do that migration in stage, like you mentioned. But the goal is that your users don't notice, but that the project team, obviously, we want to make it as easy as possible on them as well. But the ultimate goal is, because your users don't care. At the end of the day, they don't care as much as you do, unless you're creating a better experience for them.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of that bottoms up kind of grassroots you talked about, right? If you make their experience better, they're going to be more bought in to go through that migration, because they get benefits out of it at the end of the day.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's what we really pitch our teams is make sure you're selling internally. You're selling not only to key leaders, but to the key teams. Who are the influential teams that you need to go and talk to? And maybe these are the pilot teams that you move their apps first and give them that better experience. And then you can get some good groundswell of support. Instead of, the reverse can happen as well. It's sort of internal marketing.
Yeah. Tops down meets bottoms up. Everybody's happy when they get to the middle.
That's right. That's the goal. That's right.
Right. Exactly right. Jason, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
To learn how to migrate your identities to the cloud, please visit securityweekly.com/ping. We'll be right back in a few moments with weekly enterprise news.
Customers want fast and frictionless digital experiences, yet also expect protection against breaches, privacy violations, and fraud. Drive engagement by optimizing security and convenience to attract and retain customers. Use the PingOne cloud platform to build, test, and optimize digital experiences. The no-code orchestration engine weaves together authentication, user management, and MFA, all of which can enhance security, drive engagement, and boost revenues. Visit securityweekly.com/ping identity to learn more. Managing and protecting the world's grueling number of endpoints, enabling Tanium's customers to see, control, and protect every endpoint everywhere. Tanium's mission is to provide certainty in uncertain times with the industry's only converged endpoint management. Trusted by the U.S. military and the majority of the Fortune 100, Tanium helps manage and protect nearly 30 million endpoints. Tanium, the power of certainty. Visit securityweekly.com/Tanium to learn more.
Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Follow us on LinkedIn for updates across our organization, show highlights, and more. You can find us by searching for Security Weekly Productions. You can also find me and all the hosts, because pretty much all of us have it linked in our profiles. All right, let's dig into some articles. Adrian was nice enough to pull funding announcements. But before we start, I have to say, so every quarter on Business Security Weekly, I do my security money segment. And I always come to the show notes for this show every quarter to pull all the latest funding information, because I don't think most people realize that, like, every week you guys cover more funding information than I see anywhere else. And it's a great source to, like, for me to pull all the private kind of funding stuff together. So thank you for all the work that you do every week. It helps me with my other segment.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take 110% full credit because Adrian's not here to call me a liar. So, no, the reality is Adrian really, really kicks butt pulling that together. He's got a bunch of great sources. It's kind of neat, Matt, and I would love your thoughts on this. I think more often than not, the individual funding announcements are interesting to talk about, but I think more often than not, it gets really interesting when we start talking about the massive trends, right? Like, we're seeing large amounts of funding going into API sec this month, or because I feel like investing in cyber is a herd mentality. Have you seen similar things?
Yeah, because I've been doing this segment for 4 years now, every quarter, you start to see certain trends. You start to extract out some very interesting things. So yes, you'll start to see a whole group of funding announcements around a very specific area, because that's the hot trend at the time. I also look at it from what the public market's doing, because I created my own index called the Security Weekly 25 Index, tracks the pure play security companies. And what's been difficult lately is there is so much private equity money coming in and pulling public companies out that it's actually getting harder for me to find companies that fit the profile to replace them in my index, right? Ping, just on last segment, bought by Thoma Bravo. ForgeRock, SailPoint. Thoma Bravo has taken 3 public identity companies out of the market in the last 2 quarters. Like, the number of zeros behind that is just, it's amazing. Like, that's really interesting to me. Like, that's a really interesting trend. What is Thoma Bravo going to take these 3 identity players, and what are they going to do with them?
Yeah, and we've talked about this quite a bit on the show, but the KnowBe4 acquisition is another good example of the take private that's occurring there. It's one of those situations, I think, where the PE people, normally they'd look at buying a chunk of a company and riding it up or riding it down. And they're looking at the depressed valuations of the public market and going, hey, this is just so stinking low right now that we're just going to literally buy the whole thing and just let it come back up and then re-IPO it. They may not even have to make drastic changes at the leadership level to squeeze blood from the turnip, as they call it. They may not even have to do that. It just could be a market cyclical thing that they're going to cash in on here.
Yeah, I had Robert Herjavec on Monday on Business Security Weekly. It was a great interview because we were talking about the market and what's been going on, and the KnowBe4 acquisition we brought up as well, right? It's hard for these companies to grow at the rates they need in the public market with a depressed market. Valuations have come down. So to your point, PEs come in, pick these companies up. As the market picks back up and spend picks back up, they don't have to make a lot more investment potentially to get a really good return on investment as that market returns. But you're seeing all these dynamics start to play out in the public market. The other thing I've noticed is there's still money coming into these, and there's a good number of funding announcements we're going to go through. But here's what I'm seeing. The dollar amounts are smaller. They're not the big 100 plus, 250 million plus investment rounds. There's definitely been some suppression on the amount of money coming into some of these funding rounds, for sure.
Yeah, and that definitely has been the case. Later the stage, the more the compression. Cs and Ds are really compressed to the point where they're even having trouble finding money at this point. You get earlier, I think the percentage compression might be the same, but the dollar amounts are obviously absolute value much smaller. But it is even starting to hit like some of the seed and A level players, right? Which is where I spend most of my time. And those guys are even sitting on situations where it's like, yeah, you used to be a 20, 25 valuation. Now we're going to give you 12. We're going to give you 10, right? And that seems to be the new norm for even those seed and pre-seed style investments in cyber.
Yeah. And if you look at what's happening, even on the list of companies we have today, the amounts are lower. And so it's definitely a trend. I'll ask both of you, what do you think this signals to the market? Do you think it's just hey, let's wait and see, all financial stuff is cyclical? Do you think we'll see a slowdown in the number of entrants from the vendor side to the market?
No, we won't see a slowdown in entrants. I think we're going to see a continued push for new startups occurring. I think it'll be harder to get funding, but if you've got the right team, the right company, the right market, you'll get the money. It's just going to be smaller amounts, and it's going to be a little bit of a safer investment from the VC itself. They're not going to take the risk of massively overfunding you, knowing that somebody else is going to pick up the bag with a A or a B or a C later on.
Yeah, I think the other thing, so we covered part of this with Robert on Monday. Innovation's still going to happen, Tyler, to your point. Companies are going to come in, valuations are going to be different, funds are going to be different. We're going to see some interesting consolidation, Katie, where you're going to see some of the big players who are sitting on cash be able to scoop up things that they can tuck into their portfolio because valuations have come down. But the one buzzword that came out of the session was EBITDA. You have to show that you can become profitable. It is not growth at any cost anymore. EBITDA and gross margins will play in to how valuations going forward, at least over the next couple of years. He predicts 2 to 3 years, by the way, because he says the final shoe in the market has not dropped, and that's consumer spending. But when it does, that's when we start the year and a half to 2 year haul out of this. And he said that shoe has not dropped yet. That's why he's still predicting 2 to 3 years of some of this in the market.
What an amazing...
So this is actually good. For one could say this is actually really good for the market because it makes companies be more accountable for what they're building, how many people they're hiring, the viability of the products and services in the market. It's harder because you don't get as many handouts, but if you're going to have a really good product, in a hot market, if it's easier to raise 20 million, maybe you're not as careful about the features you build or the frequency with which you build them. But in a slower market, in a market that's a little depressed, you have to show value as soon as possible, really.
Yeah, what a great interview that must have been, Matt. I didn't have the opportunity to listen to it. I'm going to go back and listen to it for sure because it's right in my area of interest that I spend most of my time researching and looking into. I think, listen, fortunes are made in down markets, right? That's the statement. That's the saying. Cash is king right now. If you're sitting on cash, sit on it. Wait a little bit more, right? And wait until you're confident that we're going to be on an uptick swing. And I think it's somewhere between next summer, next fall, and could be even a little bit longer, right? That's the way I look at it, anywhere from a year to a year and a half, 2 years. But between now and then, I don't think we have much downside left because if you look at the publicly traded cyber companies that are out there, they're on 70, 80, some of them even like, I don't remember the exact number for Okta, but it's like 80, 90% compressed from its high. I mean, it's a massive dump. And so, some of these companies are so horribly undervalued. Look at Meta last night. They're down like 18 to 20% today on earnings last night, which puts them at an absolutely, basement level pricing. And so, fortunes are made in these environments, and that goes for, investors in the public market, but it also goes for VCs that are now putting money to work in today's economy. It goes for startups and founders that are founding startups at day zero today, right at the bottom of the barrel. The last time we've seen a massive vintage of large return companies came out of the 2008 financial crisis. And so if we fast forward 5 to 10 years, I think we'll see a similar return on startups that are coming out right now in the next 18 months.
Yeah, and that's why you're still seeing funding announcements, right? We're seeing, and they're coming from interesting places, right? Like who's making some of these investments? You got funds starting, but there's interesting areas in here, like PII and privacy, I think is going to just continue to take off. So you've got, but this is a $50 million debt financing round, right? Which means they raised money, they need more money, but they can't go raise right now. So let's do some debt financing to give us what we need to continue to move forward. This is the Anonis. I don't even know how you say that one. Anonis.
Anonymous? I don't know. Sounds like a shortened version of anonymous. I don't know.
Yeah, that's what it's supposed to be, I think. Anonos?
Yeah, don't invest in this company. It's a no-no.
Yeah. A no-no. And then you've got people like, so you said Okta, right? There's a lot of, so Okta Ventures, there's a few others that are making really interesting investments. And it's interesting to watch a tech company with their venture funds making investments because it starts to give you a little purview into areas they're thinking about for expansion. So this one, HYCU, do they call it Haiku? A Series B extension from Okta Ventures, but it's going to add into the raise they already have, and this is all about data protection in multi and hybrid IT environment. So, does that give us some purview of where Okta's going? And they moving from identity into some data stuff coming along? Kind of interesting purview.
That seems like a massive stretch if you think of the strategy for Okta. Like, I don't understand how they get 1 foot into the data security pool. I don't know how that works without them drowning or at least thinking that it's not the correct temperature for them. But you're right. Like, that's exactly typically what these corporate investments are, right? So generally a corporate venture capital looks to put a little bit, and I'm talking a little bit for these guys, $2, $3, $4 million, not a whole lot of money, but to make sure that they're involved in the continued corporate development of a target company that might fit a future strategic direction. And so they'll put in $2, $3, $4, $5 million. They'll monitor them closely. They'll get board minutes. They'll get information that's coming out of the business, so that when the timing is right, they are at the table first to feed when it comes to acquisition. That's what a lot of this stuff really looks like. And, I'm not sure how Haiku, if that's how you pronounce it, fits into Okta's long-term vision. There's also a spot where, listen, CVC, like if you look at the way Dell runs corporate ventures, the Dell corporate venture capital stuff is completely disconnected, isolated, firewalled off from the general Dell business approach. And they invest in stuff that's going to return dollars, right? They're there for the ROI of the dollar. But you're right. In the majority of corporate venture capital approaches, including likely Okta, Cisco, and others that are commonly seen, it's usually a predetermined indicator of where they may make an acquisition in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah. Some interesting. Anybody interested in the firewall orchestration space?
What is firewall orchestration? Like, what are we orchestrating? Like, are firewalls even a thing anymore in modern cloud deployment?
This is my point. Like, are firewalls even a thing anymore? Like, we've moved beyond this with the whole pandemic. Like, I just can't. I don't understand this investment. It's a extension of their Series D, firewall orchestration space. Like, guys, firewalls, like, there's nothing to orchestrate anymore. Like zero trust and ZTNA did replace all this stuff. Like,
I mean, it could be a definition of firewall, right? It could be a definition of firewall in the sense that if we're talking about ACLs or access control lists or cloud-centric VPC definitions of who can get to what, if they're extending the definition of firewall to be a more modernized version of firewall, then maybe. Otherwise, I don't get it.
Why do you think Palo's doing so much with Prisma and Cortex?
Yeah.
What's the I understand firewall, I understand orchestration. I don't understand firewall orchestration.
I'm thinking like Skybox and Tufin, where these solutions were built to manage all the firewall rules across all the different firewalls that an organization would have. I just don't see that being an environment that people need to solve anymore. Like, I don't see it. That's what I read it as.
Yeah. So my guess here is that with the explosion of application native cloud development and APIs in the cloud and the spin up, spin down that occurs on massive numbers of APIs, I believe that API security is going to be one of the biggest markets in the next 5 years. If we believe that's the case, the orchestration of, hey, here's a new API that's being spun up in Kubernetes that has got to access these 4 other APIs or 4 other backend systems for data transfer, right? Because it used to be you shove one app in the cloud. Now it's exploded into 50 or 100 different microservices and micro apps. And I think the automation orchestration of how those can all communicate in real time as new services are spun up and spun down and what they need to have access to, that's probably what they mean by firewall orchestration. If it's not what they mean by firewall orchestration and that they mean that they can take my 1998 checkpoint box and make it talk to another one, that's a different story.
A turnkey platform.
I think you're right.
Wait, hold on one second, Katie. I'll let you get back. Here's a description. A turnkey platform to easily convert your physical firewalls to virtual ones.
Wow. So they are converting my 1998 checkpoint.
It also says automatically deploy, scale, and optimize virtual network firewalls.
Yeah, that's where the value is. That's where it's got to be. And they've got to do it in a dynamic way that's based off of API definitions, based off of microservices or even service mesh-based models. That'd be the only way for it to find value.
Yeah, agreed. Outthink raises $10 million in seed round. They compete directly with Living Security, my new company. They're building a cybersecurity human risk management platform. We've built a human risk management platform, and I know how far $10 million will get you.
Jump to the next story.
I'm just going to shoot him down just because it's a competitor to you, Matt. I'm just going to get your back like a good host should do.
I know the amount of work Living Security's put into the platform. I know what we've spent over the last couple of years to get to where we are. There's a lot of work to do. Let me just say that. And you've got a few major players with a huge head start in this market. Now, it is an evolving space. It's a very interesting space. Forrester kind of put it on the map initially, but Gartner is there. I've been doing analyst briefings with the analysts and Gartner's on this. So there is a lot of potential growth in this human risk management environment. I just think there's already an established set of competitors really pushing the envelope. And it's going to be harder for startups with seed funding to get in quickly, I think, because the market's going to move very fast.
So can you help me? Give me 2 to 3 sentences, distill what human risk management means from a fundamental, like we do X, Y, Z, and 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, it's a simple message from me. The goal that everybody really wants in the industry is to change human behavior. That's the stated goal. The problem is you can't change what you can't measure. And the biggest gap in the industry, Tyler, right now is the ability to quantify human risk. What is risky behavior? What are risky activities that users are taking? Because if I can't baseline that, there's no way I can engage them with the right content and the right policies to get them to actually change their behavior. It goes back to the whole concept of safety versus security. Okay.
Gotcha.
And so from our perspective, we start with quantification. So we build a quantification engine so that we can actually quantify human risk. Leverage that data to actually engage the human with the right content, whether it's communications, whether it's training, whether it's policy adjustments. It doesn't really matter. What we want to make sure is that we're engaging them appropriately. A one-size-fits-all security awareness and training program no longer works. Just doesn't. And then what we do is we actually measure the change in behavior. Because we've measured it and baselined it, we can see what these activities are doing, Tyler, to figure out what is actually working and not working, and is it making a positive impact? That's living security in a nutshell. Got it. And that's, I think Outhink could take some positioning and messaging information from that right there. Sounds like a good message to me. Yes. Let's see. Any other interesting ones in here that we should talk about? Another seed round, 10 million. Blockchain security, 4.2 million. I'm surprised. Crazy. I'm surprised blockchain security company could get anything right now. In the Web3 crush, in the crypto crush. Man, I'm just surprised that even having a blockchain thing at this point is just a difficult thing to raise on. So they got $4.2 million seed round led by IOSG Ventures, and they're a services firm that focuses on blockchain-related audits and penetration tests. That was probably a $42 million investment seed round a year ago. So I'm surprised they could get anything at this point. It's going to be interesting to track. You know, I'm an old pen test guy. I'm an old security guy, and this is an area that I know T-Rob is really, really passionate about and really good at. And this is where I would defer to him on like what it really means to pen test that universe. But is the total addressable market on that one big enough right now? Right? Is blockchain going to have enough actual penetration testing needs and requirements in the near future? I'm just not convinced. Me either. Let's move to acquisitions and failed acquisitions or exits. So Palo Alto, the deal to acquire Apiro falls through. And so they're like, never mind. We'll go buy cybersecurity for $200 million. That's not fun. That didn't get through either, though, did it? Cider? Yeah, that's the active one right now. They're in the middle. Yeah, so that's active. And my latest intel on that one is that one's not going to go through either. What I've heard on the market on that one is that like most, I would say, cybersecurity companies that are in the stage of cider, as far as like their current growth stage, they have an overinflated sense of, I want to say ego, but that's not the right word, but certainly an overinflated sense of valuation of what they really are and what they really mean. And they just haven't course corrected yet. And so I don't think that, from what I've heard from digging in on sources that are in the know on that one, that's not going to go through either, because there are orders of magnitude off on valuation. Maybe not that much, but certainly off quite a bit with regards to the valuation on that particular acquisition. I bet you that one just gets ghosted, as a Halloween reference here, but it ends up ghosting. Interesting. And that's what happened with the Apiro deal. That's why it fell through. They could not agree on valuation for the purchase. Here's the reality to founders out there that are watching the show with regards to funding and exit potential. You are not in the driver's seat any longer. You were in the driver's seat up through beginning of this year. You could raise at crazy valuations, and you were raising at crazy valuations. And if you're running out of money now, you're not in the driver's seat. Take 50% off of what you thought you were. That might be able to close going forward. The compression is real. It's trickled down to the private markets from the public markets. If you were 800 before, you're 300 or 400 now. And listen, don't die on the hill because you think you're worth something that you're not, and you're not willing to compromise. Go into these negotiations with a bit of an open mind, because this stuff's not coming back for another couple of years. Yeah. And Cybereason looking for a buyer because they can't go IPO. I guess they hired JP Morgan Chase to go try to get them sold. I mean, this was a high flyer a year ago, not even a year ago. I mean, earlier this year, they took some money late last year, I think, and then like the floor just fell out of the market, and here they are. Instead of IPO, they're looking to get acquired. Yeah, I mean, this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about, right? What used to be a potential $5 billion IPO on the public markets. I've heard now rumor mill numbers that are sub
sub 2 for them, right? Taking that much of a squish down, they can't really IPO anymore, and now they're like, well, we can't raise money, right? We're in a spot where it's going to just put us in a weird, awkward position to try to raise on a down round here. We'll just try to get out of it, right? And so they've engaged with a couple of different investment firms and banking firms to try to get them actually sold off. And they're actively out there shopping the business around. You never want to be sold. You want to be bought as a company, right? And they're in the position of being sold. They're trying to figure out who they can sell to, as opposed to saying, here's six companies who want to buy us.
Yeah. And we continue to see this trend. Cyber unicorn SNCC to sack 198 employees, 14%. This is after they laid off another 30 a few months ago, back in July or whatever. So you're seeing these very interesting. And I pulled this out of the trends because I noticed you guys started covering these layoffs, and I pulled them into my security money segment. Like, this is a trend. Like, these big companies that have raised big money laying off staff.
Yeah, I can comment specifically about this. So the news article, I believe, is a week old. I didn't look at the actual date on it, but I think it's at least a week old. I think they laid off this week, like the last couple of days. They actually axed about 200. So it actually went through as predicted a week or 2 weeks ago. Put yourself in the shoes of these companies and SNCC's another great example of one that raised a ton of money at massive valuations. And you're giving yourself, let's say, 2 years, 3 years, 3.5 years of runway on those raises, okay? And you don't have the revenue to support those valuations. So now you have basically 2 or 3 years, whatever your runway is, to get yourself to that valuation. And so, no, you don't have to look at this and go, we're never going to get there. What they're doing is saying, hey, we have to lay off in order to stretch our runway long enough to reach the valuation that we just raised that last year. And what these are what they're calling zombie companies, right? So we used to be talking every single week, Adrian and Katie and I would talk about unicorns and even decacorns and, all sorts of corns. It's not the situation anymore. Now we're talking about the zombie of the day, the Walking Dead, the one that has a revenue run rate that supports 20% of their current valuation. And they're a race against time to get to that valuation so that they can either raise again or sell the company, or they're just going to continue to walk for 3 years and die. And so, one thing you do is lay off a bunch of people and stretch that runway so that you feel comfortable getting to that valuation in 3 years.
Yeah.
How Halloween of us on this discussion, right, Matt? Like zombies.
Exactly.
No more unicorns. We're going to have Gus put up some zombie icons and some zombie stuff as we talk about zombies every week on the show.
Ooh.
I love it.
So that ties into this next article that Adrian posted. VC take the 13 most promising cybersecurity startups of 2022. Really? Are they? A couple of these I think are interesting, Tyler. Right? The API security vendors, Salt and No Name, because we were talking about API explosion, the need for API security. You've got AppBay, which has been in the cyber insurance side, but we've seen lots of interesting, challenges with cyber insurance. Once you start going down this list a little more, I'm like, how many of these are still high flyers right now?
Yeah, this is a great question. You know what I would like to do is take the 13 most promising cybersecurity startups 2022, see if I can dig out their actual ARRs and their actual valuations and get a multiple number on that today. And you'll real quickly see which ones are actually zombies and which ones are actually growing at a rate that might make it reasonable. I've heard phenomenal things, for example, about the growth rate of No Name. I don't remember the exact numbers. I'd have to look them up. So this is not a quotable number for those out there. But I've heard they've jumped from something like 5 or 7 million of ARR last year to like 30 plus in a year, which is a massive growth rate, right? So they're likely justified in valuations that they're starting to get. I know Salt is growing like crazy. Which one I do love too is super, super young guys, and they have to be careful not to over pull VC money is Tynes. Tynes is doing some amazing stuff on some of the automation side of cyber. R2C is growing like crazy as well. So, I think this list has probably the bulk of younger or even middle-aged or teenaged cybersecurity companies with massive growth rates over time. And it's a question right now. I love it, Gus. I love that. Thank you. Talking zombies. I think the question right now is, can they maintain that growth rate so that it doesn't fall flat and that they turn into the zombies of the day?
Right. Yeah. And that's why I said the new buzzword in cybersecurity, EBITDA. It's EBITDA.
Earnings.
You guys can talk about XDR and zero trust, but at the end of the day, what investors are looking for is EBITDA.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely, certainly in the later the stages, the more EBITDA, margin focused, cash focused that they're going to be. When you're still in the early stage, you can kind of get away with it a little bit more. But it's funny, there is one company that I won't name that I advise that I'm an investor in actually, and I had a conversation with the founder the other day, and he's very adverse to a super high growth, mega high growth. He wants to grow at a healthy rate with a healthy pace for the company, which fits very well for today's investors. But I think there's a fine line, and this is a difficult thing for founders to figure out. There's a fine line on how much you turn that volume up. Traditionally, we've always turned it to 11 and said, grow at all costs. It doesn't matter. You're either going to turn into a unicorn or you're going to die trying. That's no longer reality. But at the same time, you can't just leave it on one and go, oh, I'm just going to be a safe player and I will be profitable from day one, because you leave so much growth potential and value for your business on the table that there's got to be somewhere 4 or 5. I don't know what the number is. And I had a conversation with this founder and was like, look, man, it's time for you to turn it up, right? Your traction's there. All your proof points, your product market fit is there. Turn it up a little bit. I'm not telling them to burn at all costs, but I am telling them, hey, put a little gasoline on this fire and let's get moving here, right? So, I think it's just a fine line, and I think we'll see over the next few years that comes and goes depending on the stage of the business that you're in and what your competition is doing too. That you have to kind of watch that. If your competition is lighting money on fire, you can try to play the same game and outpace them, high risk. Or you can just say, we're going to take a slow growth approach here and let them flame out, let them define the market, and then we'll catch what's left. And that works too. I think it's a lot of strategy you need to consider as a CEO that up until last year or up until the beginning of this year, you didn't even have to think about, because the answer was always go as fast as you can.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. It's interesting conversations because, as you know, I advise a number of companies as well. Plus, I'm in a startup, right? And this is, I can't build things fast enough. Right. And we want to go faster because we've got this great market opportunity in front of us. But you also have to make sure you got enough cash to do it, because the faster you burn cash, the more quickly you have to raise. And if the raise environment's not right, you're not going to get the valuation you want. So it is a very interesting balance, Tyler, that startups have to go through at this phase, especially in this type of market.
Yeah, and it'll come and go. It'll come and go too, right? You're going to go through, I describe it as accordion. Like, I feel like a startup is largely an accordion, right? Where you get going and you stretch and you just, you squeeze it in and you press hard and you burn fast. But then you got to remember that there's the other side of that accordion. You got to stretch it back out. You got to let the music come out. You got to absorb what you have. And I think there's times for a startup to really go hard. And then there's times for them to stay flat, maybe pay down some tech debt, maybe make sure that their customer success plans work as originally intended, that they have true product market fit, whatever those situations are. And then once you get that all on lockdown again and you feel comfortable and you feel good, you can burn hard again, right? So I think it's a waxing and waning kind of approach that will eventually win. Because if you overcorrect and just say, I'm just going to go slow, you'll never get there. And if you overcorrect and burn too fast, you're going to flame out and you'll never get the next round of investment, because they're looking at things like EBITDA and margin. And I think that's just it's something you're going to have to watch as a founder and play that accordion.
Yeah. Katie, where do you want to go? We've been monopolizing like all this funding talk.
That's okay. I always learn something on every show about investing, because I'm just a working stiff here. So
you can learn how to play the accordion, Katie.
I probably could figure it out. I had to play the piano to get through college. So
for those that don't know, Katie has a music degree. I bet you she could play the accordion.
I have a bunch of useless music degrees. How about nudge security? That should interest you too, Tyler, because Adrian's take was that this is something new and different, and where's the market fit? I think we could already say that there is a market here for SaaS app identity. I'm pretty confident that I would say that.
I'm pretty sure
Yeah, no,
Tyler would too.
Yeah, I was briefed by Nudge already. I like the
Yeah,
guys; they're good.
I
They're
mean,
really cool. It's a common market. They're doing it a little differently, and I don't want to get into their secret sauce. I'll let them do that. But suffice it to say that SSPM, which is a market, and I'm surprised in the show notes, Adrian says, I'm sure Gartner is working on an acronym for this. They already have one. It's SSPM, SaaS Security Posture Management. They're doing it in different ways, right? Like there's some companies that will look at your data going in and out of your environment and automate and detect what SaaS services you're using that way. There's others that even connect to your email system and look at what what SaaS services are being emailed to your user base for like login credentials and things, and identify them that way. There's lots of different ways that you can identify the SaaS services in use, and then connecting to those ones that are in use over APIs and securing them and making sure they're configured properly. It's a market that's not old. But it's certainly not like, hey, this is the first time I heard about it last week. But I think Nudge is taking a unique approach to it. I'd advise folks that are listening, if they're into that and they need that kind of service, go directly to Nudge to understand the how they do it, because it is unique and different than most. Plus, the guys are super cool. Really like the founders. I think it's a pretty cool company.
Yeah, it's a good market. It's an important market. If you look at the problems that we're having with unmanaged apps, the problems we're having with shadow IT, the problems with user data, customer data, employee data going into apps that IT doesn't know about, you need something to find these apps. So their approach does look different, the approach, but the overall message and the overall functionality it's a hot market. I can tell you, we're looking at new entrants every day, like literally every day there's somebody else that pops up on our radar.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I love the space. I think it's a very hot space, specifically because SaaS services are growing. They're not going away, and I think more and more people are going to be using SaaS services to how they run their businesses. We switched to the infrastructure in the cloud, which is where Amazon really excelled. And now we're switching to everything being SaaSified, right? And I can go on and on for what that means to all sorts of different cyber components and cybersecurity related companies. But no, it's not a new market. And quite frankly, from an investment standpoint, I really like these guys because they're doing it differently. It gives them the ability to have differentiation in market, but it's a market that's very clearly well defined from a value proposition, what you do. You just have to do it better than anybody else in the market to dominate the space. And so, as far as SSPM goes, look at the how they do it and see which ones make the most sense for you as a business. That's where you need to buy.
The only thing I would ask, and I just don't know enough about this company, but if they're monitoring Google Workspace and M365, what about custom built apps? What about apps that aren't on those marketplaces? How do they detect those? How do they find those?
Because that's marketplaces. They're looking at the authentication system itself. So if you use Office 365 to authenticate to a SaaS service, they can detect that authentication occurs. That's where they're getting their data from. Like I said, I think it would be really cool technology, and they might be doing this eventually. I don't want to ruin their futures, but I think the best SSPM vendor looks at the authentications occurring in your Gmail, in your Google, or looking at your Office 365. I think they also look at authentication and sign up emails within the email systems of the enterprise. I think they look at data too. They look at data in transit on the network where they can capture it and see additional angles into what SaaS service is being used by your endpoints, right? Somebody that rolls all three of those together and can actually catch everything is going to be in really good shape. Now, each of them will defend their way of doing it, right? They'll say this way's the best and here's why. But if you could do all three, that'd be pretty powerful.
Yeah. Ties into these next couple articles, which I thought were interesting. The company behind Hey.com and Basecamp vocally ditches AWS and GCP. They're like, yeah, too expensive for us. We're going back to on-prem. There was a number in the article. They spend something like $500,000 a year for RDS, and they're like, "Look, we can run our own database for less than that." Interesting, because as you just said, everybody's SaaSifying, right? But are they?
So this is interesting because I just wrote an article on this. I saw this a couple of days ago, and I wrote something that's coming out. So I might change some of the things I say based on our conversations and your input here. But it's an interesting conundrum because you have this, everything is SaaSified for sure, and more companies are going to the cloud, just like we have with our last guest talking about. It's just easier and it's faster for a lot of companies. But if you get to a certain size and scale, then yeah, you just have to look at that ROI. I don't think this is the wave of the future. I just don't. Because I don't think a lot of companies have the time or the inclination to build out these teams. But on the other hand, if they do, you do have to look. You can't just adopt something because everybody else is adopting it. That herd mentality is prevalent in security. But it's not always the right approach because you really have to look at your own environment, your own capabilities, your staffing budget, your skills capabilities. We've got a staffing problem as well. So it's not just like, okay, hire the people and you're good to go. That's not the case, and it's not going to be the case for a long time. But if you are spending as much time maintaining somebody else's environment where I understand they could be a single point of failure, and to our last guest point, yep, they have the teams there in place, ready, on call, and waiting, whereas another company might not. But once you get to a certain size, you're a leader in the market, you've got the skills, you have to make that determination, even if it's not what the Gartners and the Forresters of the world are saying. Everybody's moving to the cloud adoption up 98%, or, obviously I made that number up, but we have seen since the start of the pandemic, even more companies using public cloud because they had to. But now we're getting to a point where we're going to start to see baselines because the pandemic isn't necessarily over. I don't want to get into controversies and politics and all that garbage. But the fact of the matter is we're reaching a point with our workforce where it's reaching a place of stability in its instability. So the baselines are starting to come back again. And that's what we have to be looking at as companies. And we have to be looking at our balance sheets and saying, what do we use? How do we use it? Now we have some stability now. So what do we use? How do we use it? How can we manage it? Because moving more to the cloud is not going to be for everybody.
Yeah.
But then again, I don't see most companies pulling out like they did.
What a great article. Like, I totally agree with you. What a fantastic article, because I don't think what Hey did is the easy button, right? The easy button is just leave it in there, get more money and burn harder. And right. I think what we will see here is, well, there's a couple things. There's the fluctuations of a business of scale that make it difficult at that middle stage. When you're little, the fluctuations aren't that painful. When you get to that middle stage, if you ramp on a bunch of users and run them through the roof fast and do big marketing pushes, those fluctuations, you have to plan your capacity for the fluctuations, and that gets expensive. And that's one of the reasons why that middle stage is kind of a difficult situation there, right? The other question is, it's not just about, hey, we're going to put bare metal in our data center. A lot of companies don't even have data centers. They got to build data centers. They got to hire a bunch of people. I think there's a whole lot of math behind this that would have to be done on a project by project basis to determine whether it's financially viable to bring it back in-house from your cloud deployments when you reach that mid stage, or whether you're better off plowing through it and saying, hey, we're good enough. We're going to plow through it and get to the large stage. And then when you're at the large stage, you've got the capabilities and weight to go, hey, we're paying you $10 million a year. We're going to negotiate that down to a flat 6. We can spike to these things. Like, you get a lot more negotiation power when you get bigger. And that's why that difficult middle stage is a bit of a squeeze. So, I think at the end of the day, it's not a cut and dry, we're going to see a mass exodus. I don't think it's cut and dry, we're going to see massive growth either. And here's my prediction on this one, is that the market will correct. And the market being Amazon, Google, and Azure, they will correct for this problem eventually. And it could be the funding downturn and the macroeconomic downturn that causes them to correct, because companies like Hey are going, I can't afford this anymore at that middle level. So I'm going to pull out. I'm going to find a way to do it a different way. And they're going to have to adjust their prices. They're going to have to adjust their scale capabilities. They're going to have to find their packaging in a different way. A lot of different ways they can fix it. But I think the market, I'm a firm believer in capital markets in general. I think the market will sort itself out as those mid-tier players start going, hey, this is too painful.
And I don't think this is uncommon. I mean, the cloud actually has been around for a really, really long time. We just think of it as the cloud for the last 20 or so years. But, in any product market where the product is really, really, really hot, right? Like you see it every Christmas season with kids' toys. That hockey stick growth. Everybody's clamoring for the toy. People will pay whatever it takes for the toy. After a couple of years, that toy, the kids don't want the toy anymore. They bring the price down. They make it more accessible. They do some tweaks and some changes so that the company doesn't die off, or they just create new services. We're not talking apples to apples here with the toy market and the cloud market, but I think the same premise holds, is that for the past 20 years, first we took a while for people to get comfortable with the idea of cloud. Then people were like, yeah, cloud's pretty good, not going to move everything. Then we started moving to hybrid cloud for the single point of failure reasons. Then it was, oh my God, we must go to cloud because this is the easiest thing to do in a really terrible situation. And now it's, okay, we've got pretty mass adoption of cloud. What do we do next? And I just think the real key here is individuality and not following the herd on this, because I don't think just because an analyst firm or just because, three Yahoos talking on a podcast have an opinion, that's what is right for your business. I think it's very much a financial calculation, like you said. And I think it's really important for companies to remember that they don't have to do what is in those analyst reports or what the analyst data says if it doesn't make sense, because this isn't one of those things like, if you don't secure your APIs, you're screwed. That's not the same calculation.
Yeah. Katie, just so you know, we're not three Yahoos on a podcast. We're two Yahoos and Katie. So let's make sure we get that straight.
Yes, I resemble the Yahoo remark. I'm fully comfortable with it too.
All right, Rain.
Exchange server, anybody? Not secure? Like,
surprised?
Surprised? No, not really.
Hey, 1999 called. They want their news back, Matt.
That's a your old when joke.
Yeah, the beard is coming quite gray over the years, Katie, I must say.
Yes. There's a couple of quick trends. This whole Gen Z and millennials less serious about cybersecurity on work issued devices than personal. Is anybody surprised by this? Like the whole Gen Z millennial they're just different. Like, did we expect them to be the same?
Hey, you better be careful now. You're going to sound like the old curmudgeon here. You keep that up.
I am the old curmudgeon.
I don't know, man. So I'm part of a Gen Z investors, and I don't know, they should have never invited me to it, but I'm part of a Gen Z investors Slack, where it's all Gen Z related angel through like full on VC investors are in there, and there's a lot of them in there. It's a massive community, and I don't think they're any different than we are. I just think fundamentally, they've gotten to the point where they just tolerate it less. Like when we were younger and we were coming up, people would say, oh, you need a password that's 30 characters long, 17 special characters, 37 underscores, whatever it is, right? And we just had to do it, and you kind of just did it because it was the right thing to do. They tolerate it less now. They're like, hey, I don't have to do that. I'm not going to do that. Give me a better technology to do that, right? And they have better technologies. They have fingerprints, biometrics. They have two-factor auth, SMS-based two-factor auth. They have all sorts of different ways, Authy apps, whatever, you name it. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that they're less serious about cybersecurity. I just think that they expect a higher quality, and they don't tolerate the garbage that we've had to tolerate earlier on in our careers.
Yeah, because they grew up with these things, right? These phone thingies that we grew up with.
Yeah.
Like, it's so much easier now. And to go back to a MacBook or a ThinkPad or whatever and have to deal with all the craziness that you have to do over there when it was so easy over here is, I think, where this really gets interesting. And that's why there's kind of that disconnect, I think. Because we grew up on the computers. Like, when did you have your first portable device? Like, when did you have your first notebook, laptop kind of PC? Like, everything was wired together. It was at a desk. We never carried these suckers around. Like, I can't even remember my first one. It was had to be like 06, 07
Oh
maybe.
gosh, no, it was well before that, and it was about the size of a toolbox that was a luggable, right? That had a handle on the top of it, right? That was the original laptops, were these kind of like not even lunchbox, but literally like toolbox size, where you opened it up and there was a monitor built into a huge computer the size of a typical contractor's toolbox. Man, it's just a different world now, and I don't think that they care less. I actually think that they care more. They want it. They want privacy. They want security. They care about it. They just expect it to be delivered to them in a non-intrusive, user-friendly, great user experience kind of way. And they're not going to tolerate. If you're going to give it to them any other way, they're not going to use the technology. They just don't. And I mean, at the end of the day, right, this article is specifically about that they're less serious about cybersecurity on work-issued devices than personal, that they care more about their personal data than their work data. And of course, that makes sense, right? Because their work data they're young, they're not invested in the careers as much as older folks like we are too, and they're like, hey, I don't want it to be compromised, but if work's going to put me through 37 hurdles, I'm just going to get around it because I don't, it's just not the right way to do it. So I think it's just about making sure that they're given a great user experience. That's the only way you get Gen Z to actually come along.
And I think there's another issue that is riding sidecar to what you're saying, Tyler, and that is not only do they expect better security because they've grown up with computers, it's been in their lives, but it's not necessarily, I'm not going to get into the semantics of millennials and Gen Z care less about cybersecurity on work-issued devices, but they also live in a world where people change jobs every couple of years, whereas a lot of us started our careers and still know people our age or a little older who have been in jobs for 20 years, 30 years. That's not how work is anymore. I remember having a conversation with my mother years ago. She was like, you have so many jobs. Your father's had one job. Your brother-in-law's had one job. I'm like, that's not technology. And that's not the world today. That's not how it's going. People change jobs, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a knock on you as a worker. It's just a different world. And so if something is temporary, you're going to be less invested in it than if you think, oh my God, I'm going to be here and get that gold watch at the end of my 30 years. By the way, I don't think anybody would be impressed with gold watch anymore, but
I would.
Okay, all right. Whatever. But the idea that, oh my God, I have to be super, super careful about my work stuff because I'm going to be here for 2 years. Well, no, that's somebody else's job to make sure that that thing is secure, and you're going to be leaving anyway. And also, I think when a lot of us started our careers, because there was that worry about having a job and being in a job for a long period and being seen as less successful if you can't move up through the company over 10, 20, 30 years, we were less prone to say things. And those of us who have bigger mouths have gotten in trouble over the years when we've pushed back on policies. That's not how these generations were raised. They weren't raised to sit back and look pretty. They were raised to voice their opinions. And so you've got people who are a little older in companies hearing this thinking, oh my God, these people don't care. That's not it. They're just raising their concerns, or they're raising their dissatisfaction, or whatever the case may be. And that's being taken negatively, but it's not necessarily. Maybe it's just making people think in a different way.
Are you sure you're not a Gen Z or a millennial deep inside there, Katie? I would think you might.
These reading glasses actually give me away.
Adrian's got some great free tools listed in here. There's a couple other great articles, but I do, unfortunately, I want to wrap it up so I don't feel like I left you guys here forever, because we're almost an hour into this segment.
We could talk for days. For days.
I know, and we should. But I want to thank you so much, Tyler and Katie, for joining me today. It was a pleasure to get to host the show with both of you.
Absolutely. Thank you again.
And a big thanks to everyone for watching and listening this week's episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. Adrian's back next week. Adrian, the crew, will see you next week.